Welcome back, everyone. Would like to continue the program at this point. The next session is going to focus on the contamination of the judiciary. This is a very important topic. Very pleased to introduce two excellent speakers. We have Linda Lee Denno, who is Associate Dean at the University of Arizona, Associate Dean of Academic and Faculty Affairs and Director of Graduate Studies for the University of Arizona College of Applied Science and Technology. And also very pleased to welcome back John Seiler. John Seiler is an opinion writer for multiple publications. For a long time, he wrote editorial articles for the Orange County Register as a U.S. Army veteran and former press secretary to an office holder in the state of California. So Linda and John, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Linda, maybe we'll turn it over to you and we can show your PowerPoint.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David. Yes, John and I are excited to talk about this really important topic. I have some quotes here to set the stage. The first two you've probably heard. The Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about the impending Dobbs decision and basically threatening the court. And we'll come back to that whole business a little bit later. And then you know that our president has been very actively denouncing the court, calling for major reforms in every possible way, delegitimizing the court in ways I think that the left hopes will either, I think, intimidate the court into doing what they want, or actually get some of the changes they're looking for so they can get the court back. Next slide, please. John's going to have a lot to say about not just the journalism's malfeasance on the part of being accurately reporting the court, but just the attacks on the court in general. Because I'm the political scientist here, I thought maybe just a little bit of foundational background here would be good. We have had a Supreme Court since the beginning. It was very unclear, I think, what exactly the court's role was going to be in our separation of powers in our constitutional system. And much of that role, as most of you probably know, was created and solidified by Chief Justice John Marshall, who served on the court as Chief Justice for more than 30 years. I would argue that there are different possible roles just for what the court should do. We'll start there. Chief Justice John Marshall and the early courts looked at laws that had been passed by Congress and the states and tried to determine whether or not those laws were constitutional according to their understanding of the separation of powers, the different provisions of the Constitution, and so forth. And it was John Marshall who declared for the Supreme Court the power to do so, and that was the central power that belonged, in his opinion, to the judiciary. What we have today over many years, and you'll see the evolution very quickly in a moment, is what I call judicial policymaking. And that involves the court, rather than looking at a law and deciding if that law is a good law or a bad law, deciding how the Constitution should apply. And they also interpret laws as well. That's called statutory interpretation. We have a court for, I would probably say, for almost the last 100 years that has been engaged in something a little bit different, which I call judicial policymaking. And this is a kind of, this slide could as easily be at the end as at the beginning, but I wanted to set the stage. Why don't we want judges making policy? Well, at least us on what I consider probably the correct right or center right, wherever you might find yourself. It's because we believe, A, that's not the role of the courts, but B, the courts are not good at it. And there's a really great example of this in recent Supreme Court history, a case called Missouri versus Jenkins, where came to the court actually 3 times. Missouri had a problem with segregated schools, so there were desegregation plans. To make it very simple, a judge in Missouri decided to take over the entire desegregation process of a school district in Missouri, and among other things, demanded what the curriculum was going to be when the people didn't want to pay for things like in the magnet schools, like petting zoos and whatnot. He, as a judge, raised property taxes to pay for it. Now, after all of the millions of dollars that were spent to try to create magnet schools that would attract white students from the suburbs, the quality of the schools just continued to go down. So if you look at that bottom thing, it's the real problem is the courts are not good at it. The quote from Alexander Bickel said it in the last slide said essentially the same thing. Courts are not good at making policy. That's not their role. They don't have the give and take of politics, or shouldn't at least. They don't have expertise in things. They're not out there getting expertise. And so it's not just that the court has no role in making policy, but they shouldn't be, because it's not good government. Next slide, please. And if you'll go quickly through those, I do want to point this out. Anybody who went to law school knows that the beginning kind of judicial interpretation fell into two categories: strict construction, loose constructions. They're usually identified with Jefferson and on the one hand and the Federalists on the other. But the thing to remember, because this is the foundation of constitutional judicial interpretation, is that both sides believe that you should have the Constitution as your point of departation. The Constitution is what you should be interpreting. It's just, should you interpret it loosely? Should you interpret it more strictly, exactly what the words say? Now, of course, and this is why it's so important, I think, to look at what's the attacks on the court, because in recent years we've had the court pushing what's called a living constitution, that the Constitution, was written by a bunch of old white men, racist, awful, patriarchal white men. It's really not in any way applicable to us today. And the judge's role in all of this is to take the Constitution as sort of a guideline, but to reinterpret it so that it becomes more relevant to the political situation we have today. That is very different from the kinds of debates that occurred in the 18th century and even into the 19th century. Next slide, please. Thank you. Actually just kind of quickly go through these, because I want to give Joan a chance to talk about this too. You had some major debates. You can go on to the next one. Major debates in the 19th century, prior to the Civil War, about whether the national government should have these powers, what powers should be left to the states. Next slide. The Civil War more or less decided that issue in favor of the federal government, in favor of the national government, the powers of the national governments. Next slide. And the Supreme Court after the Civil War, despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, concentrated on economic rights for a good period of our history. You're probably familiar with some of those cases, the Lochner cases, where they overturned aggressive attempts either by the federal government, but especially the state governments, to restrict right of contract, freedom of contract, and other things like that. And then during the New Deal, during the reign of the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, FDR got very frustrated with the court's, what he considered conservative protection of property rights, because it was preventing the Roosevelt administration from passing legislation that allowed a vast expansion of the federal government, the powers of the federal government, getting down into the economic daily lives of citizens. And so, as you probably are aware, there was a big court packing scandal, you could almost call it, where Roosevelt had offered as legislation, attacking the court is what we call it. He wanted to raise the number of Supreme Court justices up to a maximum of 15 for every justice who is over the age of 70. He would get to appoint a new justice. That proposal was met with, even on his own side, with opposition. It was really a really terrible decision on his part in many ways, because even his friends in the Senate turned against him. But what really happened was it worked, because whether he intimidated some of those justices into changing their position, you had in 1937 the switch in time that saved nine. The court completely altered its direction and began, as you see here, protecting civil rights, expanding the notion of civil rights, creating civil rights that hadn't existed before. Next slide, please. And so what you see as a result of that, the Warren Court comes along, and instead of a back and forth about, is this law constitutional? Is that law constitutional? Well, we focus on economic rights. Now we're going to focus on civil rights. But what the Warren Court does is something very different. It decides for us what our public policy is going to be. Miranda versus Arizona is probably the best example of this. There was no law on the books that said that law enforcement officers could not read rights to suspects. There was no such law that they overturned. Rather, what happened was the court determined that as a matter of policy for every law enforcement agency, local, state, and federal, from that point forward, had to read a set of rights. We all know what they are. We've seen them a million times on television, and make sure that a suspect understood those rights before they could be taken into custody, et cetera, et cetera. And if that didn't happen, then any evidence obtained as a result of that failure would not be able to be used in court, according to another court created right, the exclusionary rule. So you have this whole period where the Warren Court expands rights for the criminally accused, and they expand rights for women. They do all of these things where they expand rights, but they do so in a way that's not necessarily an interpretation of the Constitution or overturning laws. Another example, Gideon versus Wainwright, where they created a right out of the Constitution to say that any person who was indigent had a right to have an attorney provided for them by the government. Constitution doesn't say that. That became a constitutional right according to the Supreme Court. Next, and just my little picture there is a reminder that even then people were not happy. Yeah, you could change it. It just says save our republic, impeach or Warren. The Brown versus Board of Education decision was very unpopular. Many of the Warren Court decisions were very unpopular. Warren Court, move on to the Burger Court. Most of the justices that decided in the affirmative for Roe versus Wade were in fact appointed by Republicans. Berger, Justice Blackmun, who wrote the Roe versus Wade opinion, was appointed by Richard Nixon. But I think you have to look at Roe versus Wade as a sea change in Supreme Court jurisprudence. The court, out of nothing in the Constitution, invented this constitutional right for women to choose to have an abortion. Everybody's familiar with it. Everybody's familiar with the fact that it is, in fact, one of the most contentious rulings in modern judicial history. I would say, before going on to the next point, that somehow that decision managed to take what had always been a difficult moral question decided by the states and turn it into the most contentious political issue in our country. And it has remained that way for now over 50 years. Another thing that happened as a result of this was the Supreme Court itself became increasingly politicized. And many of you will recall Supreme Court nominations that were extremely contentious, acrimonious. Our current president is responsible, both by examples, that's why I put him there, for just turning the entire Senate confirmation process for Judge Bork and then Clarence Thomas into a circus. You'll probably remember, Judge Bork was accused of wanting women to have backroom alley abortions. We know the awful lies about Clarence Thomas that were told. And it's never been the same since then. People have gotten through a few times with high percentage of Senate votes, but only when they've been extremely non-controversial or when the Senate and the president were held by the same office. I mean, it's just been an impossible situation because what'll happen is the Senate will ask, "What's your position on abortion?" Some of you might remember David Souter, who was appointed by George H.W. Bush. He claimed, and it was confirmed mostly based upon this fact, never to have even had a discussion about the issue of abortion in his entire life. He pretended he had not, didn't care about it, which was the only way he could answer the question and not anger both sides. Next slide, please. And John, I'm talking too much. Do you have anything to say about the Bork and Clarence Thomas fiascos and how you think they were reported? I remember them, but
Yes. Yes, I do. Thank you for having me on. And I do remember that I was at the Orange County Register, which I still write for today. That was 1987. And Justice Bork died a few years ago. He was considered the most eminent judicial professor in America at the time. And he went there before the Senate Judiciary Committee expecting to have a civilized discussion about legal matters. But instead, he ran into two people. One was Teddy Kennedy, the horrible senator from Massachusetts, died a few years ago. But the main one was Joe Biden. He was the head of the Judiciary Committee, and he conducted this kind of kangaroo court or kangaroo inquisition of Judge Bork. And Bork was kind of dumbfounded by it because he thought he would have like a classroom or a special discussion about legal matters, and then they just destroyed him, and he lost. And then the next one was there was a guy named Ginsburg who was appointed, another conservative, but it turned out he had smoked marijuana with his students. Today that
Harvard.
yeah, and so that kicked him off, and today it'd probably be mandatory for to do that. But anyway, so then finally they got Justice Kennedy, who was from California, and his father was a lobbyist, and he did what Linda did too. He faked the whole thing, but turned out he was totally pro-abortion, and gave the Obergefell decision in 2015 on the same-sex marriage thing. And then as she said, also the Clarence Thomas one, which was a total disaster, but fortunately he was ready for it. He fought back. He called it a high-tech lynching of an uppity black man. That was a great phrase. And so even some of the Democrats had to vote for him after that, and he made it. But the reporting was absolutely atrocious in New York Times, Washington Post, all those places, and the editorializing against those good justices. It was just a disaster. And as Linda said, ever since then, it's just been absolutely politicized. Oh,
Right.
one more exception. It's politicized for Republicans, but not for the Democrats. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the other ones, the current ones on the court, just kind of sang through the process, and the Republicans said, "Oh, okay, maybe like three of them are opposed to it," and so they always have the easy time. But every Republican gets grilled now that get the third degree.
Yep. And you're right. Even looking at the breakdown between the yay and nay votes for Justice Sotomayor, there I think she had 97
Yeah,
positive votes, whereas Clarence Thomas, I believe it was 49 to 51 or 48
yeah,
to 52, I forget, something like that.
yeah,
So yes, and the process, that's a whole different subject, but the process itself is not designed to be a political process. It never
yeah,
was. You have justices in the past who were, or proposed justices who were denied, but it was always politics having to do with the president, not having to do with what they would do when they got on the court, back in the days of John Tyler and so forth. And then because it had become so politicized, I'll just, and I know John probably has much to say about this too. In 2013, the Senate Democrats were getting very upset because Republicans were looking at the hacks, quite frankly, the untalented tax hacks that President Obama was appointing to the district and circuit courts, and they were at least they were holding them up, even if they weren't voting against them. And so Harry Reid triggered what's called the nuclear option, which meant that they eliminated the filibuster, the requirement that there be 60 votes to stop debate, so a vote can go forward. Just judges are confirmed, judges and justices are confirmed on a majority vote, but if you can't take a vote because of filibuster, then it can go on forever. So he eliminated the filibuster for everything but Supreme Court justices. And in 2017, after the whole debacle with Gorsuch, where Obama had appointed Garland to the Supreme Court in the last year of his presidency, and McConnell, who I am not a fan of McConnell, but what he did in that case was pretty amazing. He kept Gorsuch from even having hearings in the Senate, and Obama's term expired, and Trump won, and Trump replaced Antonin Scalia, who had died unfortunately, with Neil Gorsuch. But it could only be done because McConnell turned around and said, we're gonna get rid of the nuclear option for Supreme Court justices too. And the reason I really brought this up, and John could probably talk about this as well, nobody minded in 2013 when Harry Reid destroyed the norms of the Senate because they wanted Obama's appointees. But it just, you could probably speak to it, John. The reaction to what McConnell did in 2017 was ludicrous. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, it was totally outrageous, and you can see that in what Merrick Garland is doing. I think that this has been a revenge tour the last 4 years by Garland against Trump and against anybody. That's why they have these crazy cases against Trump. Which I just brought this one thing. This was in because I'm talking about the media. The New York Times yesterday had two stories trashing Trump. Here's one here. Filing in Trump election case fleshes out roles of a sprawling cast. This is that Jack Smith thing, and he of course works for Garland. And he populated his brief with a sprawling cast of characters. So they're going against all these people that were Trump's allies, his friends, whatever, just in this ludicrous prosecution. And this is all, like I call it, Garland's revenge. And another one here, New York Times yesterday. Why legal experts are worried about a second Trump presidency. A survey of 50 members of the DC legal establishment warned Trump could follow through on his threats to prosecute his political adversaries. And this is ludicrous too. I mean, these are all liberal legal establishment types in Washington. What else would they be? And you remember Trump said about Hillary in one of the debates, he said she's going to jail. But he was asked about that by Lex Friedman about a month ago, this podcaster guy, really good podcaster. And Trump replied he couldn't do it because she was former Secretary of State, former senator, and former wife of former president. But now they're doing that to him. And even though Hillary really was guilty, it's not a witch hunt against her because of her server and other things that she did, the computer server. So that's why this whole thing is absurd. The media report this stuff. It's every day in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, all of them in my profession, which I've been in for 49 years. And it's just disgusting.
Yep, it really is. And there's no doubt that filing by Jack Smith was timed perfectly right before the election, in violation of DOJ rules and everything else.
Yeah.
Put it to the next slide because this kind of follows on. Because so my thesis, my working thesis here that I'm trying to get you to understand, I know John agrees with, is that the moment you had a court that no longer was the avenue by which the progressive left could put their policies into effect without going through the democratic process. We know that Congress at any given point in the last 50 years was not likely to have put in place a right to abortion across the country. No way that that would have happened. But the court did it for him. The court has done a whole lot of things that the left wanted, starting, I think, way back in 1937, when the whole thing with first Garland and Gorsuch, and I agree with you, by the way, John, about Garland. I have gone so far as to wonder whether or not we would have been better off with Garland on the court rather than as Attorney General, only because, because as one member of 9, he would have been, he would have had diffused power, shall we say. And I do think that I never was a fan of his, but people I know said he was a good judge, and he was a fair judge. But this whole experience, I guess, his revenge tour, as you put it very nicely, has destroyed our Department of Justice, I think, permanently. And I wonder if maybe, no sense in going into historical what ifs, but I often wonder if we'd have been better off with Garland. Hard to say. But what we got, of course, was a fairly solid conservative majority on the court. And that's a really crazy way to put it, in my opinion, because if you actually look at the total, court decides maybe 60, some years maybe 70 cases. Most of them are not necessarily the most controversial political issues of the day, but they're also not always 5-4 or 6-3 cases. There's actually overlap between the conservative side and the liberal side. We actually had a case written by Justice Sotomayor, of whom I'm no fan of, having to do with the NRA being basically drummed out of business by a public official up in New York, and she came down on the side of the NRA. There was reasons for that. We could go into it at a different point, but there's not a clear divide. Nevertheless, there has been enough conservative justices on the court, and I call them conservative not because of their political viewpoint, but their conservative attitude toward the Constitution. Judges are not here to make policy. Judges are here to look at the original understanding of the Constitution and try to figure out how to apply that original understanding to the circumstances of today. Now, they're not hard locked. There's not even agreement amongst conservative legal scholars or anybody else exactly what originalism should look like, but it is now, I would argue, the language of the court. Even Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson and Alina Kagan talk about originalism, whereas John, would you agree with me? 40 years ago, no justice would have even brought it up, right? Who cares what the Constitution says? So all of that has meant that some of the left's most sacred decisions, like Roe versus Wade, have been overturned because, of course, even liberals have said, even the worst liberal legal scholars have said, yeah, Roe versus Wade, I'm pro-choice, I believe in a woman's right to choose, but there's nothing in the Constitution, and certainly nothing in Roe versus Wade that found something in the Constitution that makes that a constitutional right. And so when the court overturned Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision, I remember when it all happened. I'm sure you do too. Never thought it would happen, actually. It was a big deal. Prior to that, and everyone knowing that case was before the court, someone in an unprecedented action leaked a draft of the decision. Okay, that's the first of what you call it, the contamination of the court, David. That's the first of what we start to see, along with Schumer's comments, of course, the belief that somehow we should be able to force the court to do what we want them to do, by political pressure, by, in this case, attempted assassinations, as you see Justice Kavanaugh being subject to almost being killed by someone outside of his home, people marching, protesting out in front of the justices' houses, which is illegal, by the way. But as you know, John pointed out a moment ago, you don't see Garland prosecuting those people. He's too busy putting abortion clinic protesters in jail. Any comments on that, John?
Oh, yeah, that's true. And one thing I wanted to bring up is that Republicans have some responsibility here too, because as Linda pointed out, the majority in the Roe decision were Republicans, and Nixon, two of his three appointees were pro-abortion, and so was Gerald Ford's one choice, Stevens, and then even Reagan, two of three were pro-abortion. Souter for George H.W. Bush, and then George W. Bush has Roberts. So finally, you come to Trump, and he finally gives us three really, really good justices, and I think that's part of the rage against Trump, is they just can't believe that he did the right thing. And there was a guy, Howard Phillips, a great conservative who died a few years ago. But in the 80s, he warned about these people that Senator O'Connor would be bad, that Kennedy would be bad, and that Souter would be bad, but people didn't listen to him. But finally, Trump comes around and he's listening. He basically gave it to the Federalist Society and said, pick the best ones and I'll appoint them, and that has worked. But it rages the left, and as Linda said, this originalism, which the Federalist Society has done a great deal to advance. I think for about 30 years now they've been doing that. So it's a really great development.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, please. So the court actually, I mean, it was an amazing day. I remember where I was at UC Berkeley when the decision came out. We had been there with some friends from Italy at a conference, and a woman, she's actually essentially the dean of the University of Milan Law School, did a really interesting presentation about the fact that the only European country in the last 56, actually 100 years, that has had an abortion policy, as I call it, barbaric, you can call it as liberal, as the United States, was East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
And it was really quite interesting. But the conference ended, and then the decision came out the next day. And it has been the catalyst for the most egregious, appalling attacks on the court that you could imagine. Now, it's not always just we're upset about, overturning Roe versus Wade, although they're not lying about that. You have people saying the Supreme Court destroyed our constitutional right. There was ever a constitutional right to an abortion. But along with that, you've had renewed debates about how then can we rein in the court. The kind of debates, if you're as old as me, you remember having in the 1980s about how we reined in the liberal court, right? Using constitutional methods like could we bring back the exceptions clause? Could we bring back impeachment? Could we bring back ways of reining in the court statutorily so that they wouldn't keep expanding the rights of the criminally accused in ways that destroy the safety of our cities, our societies, those kinds of debates we had back in the 80s. Now, of course, the left, who's had at least a half a century, if not a whole century, of mostly Supreme Court decisions in their favor, are seeing that the Supreme Court is trying to turn back some of those really bad decisions, like the Chevron decision that was overturned, like this, even, to bring Trump back into it. And I know John will have something to say about this. The Supreme Court case that found, of course, a president has presidential immunity. That if he doesn't, you have no separation of powers, and the president has no power. We've known that since the time of John Locke. But of course, the left has twisted that whole debate about what presidential immunity means to just say the court decided in favor of Trump. Because you had mentioned that earlier, John, about Jack Smith's.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that? Or
Yeah, a lot of this is Trump derangement syndrome. And the curious thing is that now if whether or not Trump wins, the heir apparent apparently is Senator Vance, who's he's a very impressive lawyer, Yale Law, and if in the next several years, he'll be advising Trump, which I hope Trump wins. But if not, then he's going to be the one who's out there advancing these things. And he's a very smart lawyer. And so, and he doesn't have I love Trump, and he was needed to just trash the left as much as possible. But after him, then if we had a more calmer person who can push these things through, that would be absolutely fantastic. It would be like a 1-2 punch in the end, assuming we even have a constitutional republic if Kamala becomes president. I'm out here in California. By the way, we're going to have 80-degree weather today. Our state is being destroyed by the Democrats, but the weather's great. And if they destroy America under Kamala, maybe you won't have the good weather, but that's where we are.
Well, I know our friends in Phoenix, Davos in the desert are probably having 100+ degree weather today because we've got 95 down where I am in Arizona. So next slide, please. These are the things that the left wants to do. That the funny thing is seeing the left call all of this judicial activism or judicial overreach because they're reversing precedents that never should have been decided in the first place. But what I wanted to kind of emphasize here, and I know John will agree with me about this, is it's been working. The left's attack on the Supreme Court, which out of the 3 branches of government was always the most respected in any public opinion poll of any of the 3 branches of government and any of the institutions of our government. They were even many times higher than the military for the longest time in public opinion polls. But the left's constant attack has actually made a difference. Now, I will argue, didn't put this on the slide, that part of that has to do with the fact that our civics education is so abysmal that most students have no clue that there is such a thing as a separation of powers, or where any of the 3 branches of government actually fit into it, or why it's there. They don't understand the court. They can be easily fooled into believing, that the court's there to protect your rights as they define it. And if you, all of these things about court packing, term limits, and so on, all in the name of our democracy trademark. Go to the next slide, because I want people to look at this is just one poll that's come out fairly recently, not necessarily a good poll, but I mean, Emerson is not necessarily one of my favorite polls, but I think that there's that some of these data bring to light the problem that we have, and that is that you have a majority of people now buying into, according to this poll, the idea that we should have term limits, have an age limit on the Supreme Court. Kind of the same thing, not exactly, but all I would say is if there had been either term limits or age limits, we never would have had Chief Justice John Marshall on the court for 35+ years. We would have lost some pretty abysmal justices like William O. Douglas. The difference between, I think, the left and the right, quite frankly, is that we respect our institutions. We don't expect our institutions to be changed every time we don't get a result that we don't like. I think I said that right. The left wants to get rid of the Electoral College. Now they want to get rid of the Senate. We had the Supreme Court back in the 20th century decide that we had to completely redo the way our state legislatures were working because we had to have one person, one vote. Nothing in the Constitution supports the idea of one person, one vote. Of course, our founding fathers thought exactly the opposite. They were not small d Democrats. They were Republicans. They believed that democracy was a bad form of government because all it means is if a majority of the people want to take away the rights of the minority, be my guest because you're the majority. So, this whole the whole thing about our democracy makes me want to, quite frankly, throw up, but it's also very wrong. We don't have a democracy and we shouldn't be pushing it. John, do you have any comment on this? Because I'm sure as a journalist, you follow these things as well.
Yeah, definitely. The left is definitely pushing making it supposedly more democratic, the country. One of them is Erwin Chemerinsky. He's the dean of the law school at UC Berkeley, where you were recently. And he had an article in the Los Angeles Times. You can see if you look it up. And also, it's based on a book he has that just came out, just attacking all this, saying we need to get rid of the Senate. We need to make the court. I have all these changes that Biden is proposing. You know, he's against the whole Constitution now. And one thing about him is, if you look online, he was giving a class and somebody took a picture of it, one of his students, and he's telling them on affirmative action, which has been banned in California for 30 years. He was just saying them just ignore the law, just use affirmative action anyway if you're appointing people to a classroom or teachers at your school or whatever. And so for him and for all these other people, Garland and Lawrence Tribe, they hate the Constitution. They want to get rid of it. They want to have an absolute democracy, supposedly, which would last one election, and then you just have a pure tyranny anyway. So this is the way they're doing it, and it's being pushed in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, all these papers, and disgrace my profession.
I'm going to disagree with you, John, and say this isn't about having more democracy. This is about it. Our democracy trademark just means anytime the left wins.
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
Yeah. Go to the next slide, please.
And then we have about 5 more minutes.
That's what I figured. So I thought this is actually the last slide. Again, I'm very interested in what John has to say about this, because I think what we have in common more than anything is that we're trying to inform the public. We're trying to be out there explaining, the left, this is what the left is really trying to do. They can't ever tell the truth, no matter what they do. You know, one of my favorite sayings is the left wants the right to shut up, and the right wants the left to keep talking. But when they talk, as we've seen this in Kamala Ding Dong's debate performance and the things she says. She was down here in my neck of the woods last week, pretending that she was some incredible border hawk, you know, channeling her inner Donald Trump. Of course, those are all lies. They can't tell the truth about what it is they really want. So we have to tell the truth. And part of that is to make sure people understand what it is the court's supposed to do. It's not supposed to be there making policy for the left or policy for the right. We have a political system that's designed to do that. The fact that our political system is somewhat dysfunctional is beside the point. We don't get to have a court make our policy just because Congress is deadlocked. I happen to think that deadlocked in Congress is the next best thing to constitutional government. But anyway, we don't need more laws. That's my opinion. But and where does the judiciary belong in that? And where does the judiciary belong in the midst of a country that we know very well is deeply divided? I'm not the hugest fan of John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts. But one of his, and sometimes I get a little frustrated, one of his goals is to try to make the court appear as if it is in fact above the political fray. That's very difficult when you're deciding political cases like the January 6th case, like the presidential immunity case, like Dobbs, on and on, like whether or not Joe Biden can just dismiss student loans with a wave of his hand. Those are all political, very contentious political issues. And so trying to walk that line is difficult. You know, he got a court that was politicized. I do think he sometimes errs on the side of being more worried about the integrity of the court than he is the integrity of the Constitution. But that's just my personal opinion. Mostly he's done a good job. What do you think we can do about this, John?
Well, let me end on an optimistic note here. When I first started writing about the court and other things in the 70s, the left dominated the discussion because all you had was like Anthony Lewis, a very liberal court reporter in the New York Times, and then the equivalent in Washington Post.
Nina Totenberg.
Yeah, Nina
Totenberg.
Yeah, she was awful. But now we have all these things on the internet. Davos in the desert is one example. All kinds of other alternatives. if you want to, there's an instant opinion you can get after one of these court decisions. You can go to the Federalist Society or wherever. And so we have all these conservative opinions that are out there and interpretations of the court. Whereas before you were just stuck with the liberals, or if you had a subscription to National Review, which I did in the 70s when I was a teenager, then you had but they only had 70,000 subscribers back then. So this is very optimistic. We can fight back. We can do things like Davos in the desert, and we can let people know. And it's a tough battle. It's really tough, but we can keep going forward. And of course, elect Donald Trump so he can appoint some more fantastic justices.
Well, that's a very nice way to end the session. We do just one or two quick questions we'll try to squeeze in. What's the ulterior motive of trying to impose an ethics code on the Supreme Court? Is it that they'll have to be more transparent in their personal affairs, which will give more ammunition for the left to attack the justices with?
It could be that. I would argue that it's another one of the left's feints more than anything. There's no ethics problem. I mean, think about Marbury versus Madison. If the case that created the Supreme Court's power of judicial review, Chief Justice Marshall, who wrote the case itself, wrote the opinion, was the person responsible in the original case that caused it all. He was a player in it. He didn't recuse himself back in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison. The arguments against either Alito because his wife flew a flag, or the arguments against Thomas because he happens to be friends with Harlan Crow and goes on vacation. Harlan Crow's never had business before the Supreme Court. And there is no corruption there. There's no appearance of corruption. There's no possibility of corruption. Members of Congress go on junkets with their rich friends all the time, or they go at our expense, which, if you ask me, is even worse. It's all designed to do, if you think about that slide before, to undermine people's respect for the court. I saw really quick on Twitter, somebody had posted a picture of Clarence Thomas with his new RV, and it was some twit who said something like, "Women are dying, but thank God Clarence Thomas has his RV." And then someone else was, "Who paid for it?" I mean, those are stupid things, and the fact that the left can get away with that, I don't know, John.
Well,
It's asinine.
yeah, I think we can learn from them though, because when these things happen, they use any means necessary to attack their opponents. So, I mean, this whole ethics thing is totally bogus, but it sticks in people's minds. They think, the guy has the RV, got the plane rides, whatever. So we need to use that against them too. And I think Trump does that effectively. He brings up all this stuff in his discussions, in his rallies and whatever. And we need to do the same thing. Just keep hammering at them and don't be polite and nice anymore.
I think if there was ever an ethics code that required more disclosure on the Supreme Court justices' personal affairs, my guess would be that we would see that the liberal Supreme Justices earn much more money from their book advances, from their book royalties, from their speaking engagements. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was deified and created movies about her and all kinds of things where the conservative justices are demonized for every single thing they do. So,
David, and if really quick, if I could just add to that, the Supreme Court does have an ethics code. It's imposed its own ethics code. The whole thing about imposing an ethics code on the Supreme Court would be Congress doing it. And that has all sorts of separation of powers issues. I mean, if somebody could actually come forward with a case where someone on the Supreme Court decided a case because they had received a benefit of some kind from a party in the case, then you could impeach them, right? You could impeach them for that. The impeachment is the answer to that. This is just, again, it's an attempt by the left to further undermine the court. And the last thing, I know we're out of time, but I think it works. Unfortunately, we've seen even some of Trump's justices bend a little bit to the pressure that's on them. And we don't have lots of time to talk about it. I think that the election cases in 2020 are examples of that. So the left's full court press against the court actually, I think, works. That's why I say it's so important that we push back. And like the way John said, we have to stop being so gentlemanly about it. We need to play a little bit more hardball.
Right. Well, I think we have to break the session at this point. It was an excellent session on the attempts to contaminate the judiciary. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Linda Lee Denno and John Seiler, for an excellent presentation, well coordinated, good interaction, lots of very insightful points made. So thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll take a break now and we will re-adjourn in just a few minutes.
Doing well. How are you doing?
At
I'm going to
8:30
be on a
a.m.
show for an hour. 9:30.
Thank you.
9:30. 10:30. Was that?
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. It was great. Thank you.
That's great. Goodbye from California.